1960, a supply line was broken, and everything changed in 24 hours.
They did not come for Bumpy Johnson with bullets. They came for something much more dangerous. They came for his breath. In Harlem, a man like Bumpy did not stay powerful because he shouted the loudest, or carried the biggest gun, or filled the streets with bodies. Men like that rose fast and disappeared faster. No, Bumpy stayed where he was because he understood something most violent men never learned. A king does not live on fear alone. A king lives on movement. Money moving through the neighborhood. Trust moving from one hand to another. Food on tables. Numbers runners on corners. Drivers on schedule. Lookouts in windows. Cash sliding from policy shops to back rooms to safe apartments to the right palms at exactly the right hour. A kingdom was not a throne. A kingdom was a bloodstream. And on a cold evening in February of 1960, 12 men from downtown made the worst mistake of their lives. They cut Harlem's artery. They thought if they choked the flow, the man would choke with it. They thought if the runners stopped running, if the collectors went missing, if the cars carrying the money never arrived, then Harlem would panic. Bumpy would scramble. His own people would turn nervous, then angry, then desperate. Rival crews would smell weakness. Police would notice the shaking walls. The whole machine would begin to grind itself apart from the inside. That was the plan. No public shooting, no rooftop, no dramatic execution. Just silence. Silence in the wrong places. Empty hands where cash should have been. Closed doors where trusted faces should have appeared. A neighborhood waking up to the feeling that something invisible had shifted beneath its feet. And if you have ever watched a city hold its breath, you know the scariest sound in the world is not a scream. It is the absence of one. That morning, Harlem looked normal. The fruit vendors still shouted on Lenox. A woman in a red scarf still hurried across the avenue with a paper bag pressed to her chest. Men still leaned against brick walls outside pool halls, pretending not to watch everything. Radios still hummed from open windows. Churchwomen still passed by in gloves and winter coats, their backs straight, their eyes sharp, as if discipline itself could hold a neighborhood together. But underneath that ordinary morning, 5 of Bumpy's regular collection routes had already gone dark. No knocks on the back doors, no envelopes delivered, no receipts passed hand to hand, no word. By noon, 2 drivers were missing. By 1 o'clock, a policy banker on 132nd Street sent a frightened message through a barber who knew a shoeshine boy who knew one of Marcus Hale's young runners. The money hadn't been picked up, and strangers had been seen on the corner twice in the same hour. That was enough. By the time the message reached the back room of the Lenox Social Club, Bumpy was already staring at the ledger spread open beneath the yellow glow of a hanging lamp. He did not look alarmed. That was what frightened Marcus most. Men who panicked could be understood. Men who slammed fists and shouted orders still belonged to the world of ordinary fear. But Bumpy, when danger became real, became quieter. And quiet Bumpy was the most dangerous man in New York. Marcus shut the door behind him. "They took the east route," he said. Bumpy didn't look up. "Which part?" "All of it." That made Bumpy lift his eyes. Marcus was a large man, not just in height, but in gravity. The room changed when he entered it. He carried the weight of ledgers, names, debts, loyalties. He wasn't built like a flashy enforcer. He was built like consequence. Thick shoulders, calm face. Hands that could count money, break jaws, or comfort a grieving mother with equal steadiness. For 12 years, he had been the man who kept Harlem's pulse regular when everybody else wanted to beat the drum harder. "Say it clean," Bumpy said. Marcus stepped closer to the table. 3 runners disappeared before sunrise. 2 drivers never made the second pickup. 4 banks reported no collection. 1 safe apartment was tossed. Nothing taken except the route sheets. Who saw them? Not enough. That means somebody did. Marcus nodded. A doorman on 129th saw 2 sedans he didn't recognize. A woman on 7th says one of the missing drivers was pulled out of his car before dawn by men in dark coats. Nobody called the police. They never do. No. Bumpy closed the ledger. The sound was soft, final. "Who benefits?" he asked. Marcus answered immediately. "Not local boys, too disciplined." "Italians?" Maybe. Maybe Irish muscle under Italian orders. Maybe independent dock thieves trying to grow teeth. Bumpy stood slowly. He was older now than the boys on the street liked to admit. The quickness was still there, but it lived deeper. His movements were economical. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. He did not rise like a man startled. He rose like a judge about to speak. "They didn't rob the route," he said. "If they wanted money, they would have taken the cash. If they wanted blood, they would have left bodies where we could see them. This is neither. This is pressure." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "They want you to react blind. They want me to show panic. They want Harlem to see it." Bumpy walked to the window and looked through the blinds at the avenue below. Boys with newspapers. A cab stopping in dirty slush. A mother tugging her child forward by the wrist. A neighborhood pretending to be only what it appeared to be. "They think supply is the same thing as power," Bumpy said. Marcus waited. "And men who think that," Bumpy continued, "usually disappear the moment they realize they were cutting at the branch instead of the root." By late afternoon, the second message came. It wasn't brought by one of their own. That was the insult. A waiter from a midtown restaurant arrived with an envelope and a face so pale he looked sick. "I was told to hand it only to him," the waiter said. Marcus searched him. No weapon, no wire, just fear and cheap cologne. Bumpy took the envelope and opened it with a thumb. Inside was a single folded sheet. No signature, no greeting. Just a message typed in neat black letters. "Harlem eats because we allow trucks to move. Harlem pays because we allow hands to collect. You have 24 hours to accept new terms. From tonight forward, 30% moves south. Fight it, and every route goes dark. Every runner disappears. Every wheel stops turning." At the bottom, there was one extra line. "This city has changed. You just haven't noticed yet." Bumpy read it twice. Then he handed it to Marcus. Marcus read it once and muttered, "Arrogant." "No," Bumpy said. "New." That made Marcus look up. "New men always write too clean," Bumpy went on. "Old power doesn't explain itself. Old power assumes you already understand." Marcus folded the page. "So who are we dealing with?" Bumpy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Somebody trying to become old power in 1 week." That night, Harlem became a listening post. No one announced it. No one had to. Barbers listened harder while trimming sideburns. Bartenders poured slower and heard more. Porters in hotel lobbies looked at shoes, accents, wedding rings, and cigarette brands. Women on stoops noticed which unfamiliar cars idled too long. Boys delivering newspapers took the long way home for a reason. Men who worked loading docks in daylight and moving secrets in darkness began asking careful questions. By midnight, pieces started to appear. A warehouse clerk on the west side remembered seeing one of the missing drivers taken toward the river. A waitress near Chelsea heard two men boasting about starving uptown without firing a shot. A mechanic in Hell's Kitchen had serviced 3 borrowed sedans 2 nights in a row for cash, no names, and 1 repeated destination. An old produce depot near the freight yards. And then came the name that made the room go cold. Vincent Vale. Not famous. Not yet. That was what made him dangerous. He wasn't one of the legendary bosses whose names drifted through police reports and whispered meetings. He was something newer, and in some ways, worse. A sharp man with patience, ambition, and just enough distance from the old rules to think he could replace them. Vale had been an accountant once, or close enough. He understood shipping manifests, trucking schedules, warehouse inventories, missing percentages, delayed cash. He studied systems the way other men studied weak chins or unguarded pockets. He had spent years around bigger men, learning one lesson very well. If you can't kill a king in public, unmake his kingdom in private. By 1 in the morning, Marcus had a file of fragments laid across the table. "Vale's been building for 6 months," he said. "Quiet. Small crews, no flashy killings. Bought 2 warehouse foremen, 3 drivers on the west docks, 1 dispatcher in Jersey. He's been learning our timing." "Who sponsors him?" Marcus shook his head. "Nobody openly, which means either nobody or someone smart enough to hide." Bumpy sat in the smoky back room with a cup of coffee he had barely touched. The light caught the lines in his face. Not weakness, mileage. "Vale made one good decision," he said. Marcus looked at him. "He didn't come at me with pride. Pride is loud. Supply is real." "Sounds like respect." "No, it sounds like homework." Marcus leaned on the table. "So what do we do?" That was the question everyone around Bumpy always asked eventually. What do we do? Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked ideas, but because Bumpy had a gift very few men possessed. He could take chaos personally, feel it fully, and still answer it like math. "We do not spend the night chasing our own tail," he said. "We do not flood the streets. We do not scare our own people. We do not let the neighborhood wake up thinking the machine broke." Marcus understood immediately. "You want normal." "I want better than normal. I want smoother than normal. Tomorrow morning, every route that can move, moves. Every collector not missing gets a shadow. Every bank gets reassurance. Every worried face sees discipline. And the missing? We find them." "And Vale?" Bumpy finally took a sip of the cold coffee. "We let him believe his note worked." Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Then a slow understanding crossed his face. "He expects panic," Marcus said. "Yes." "He expects you to defend the routes." "Yes." "He expects you to put men where the money is." "Yes." "And you're not going to." Bumpy set the cup down. "I'm going to put men where he is." Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories like this. Your support helps keep these beautiful stories alive. At dawn, Harlem moved as if nothing had happened. That was the first thing Vincent Vale got wrong. He had expected whispers to become tremors by breakfast. He had expected corner men to disappear, collectors to stall, nervous faces to create visible fractures. He had expected Bumpy Johnson to send muscle into the streets like a man trying to hold water in his hands. Instead, Harlem looked annoyingly intact. A substitute driver ran the morning packet to 135th. A retired collector came out of nowhere to cover 128th. A church deacon's nephew carried messages between two banks that normally never spoke directly. A cab company loyal to Bumpy rerouted 2 cars and quietly filled the transport gap before lunch. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. More than enough, in fact, to send the message that Harlem was not a beast stumbling after a wound. It was an organism healing while it hunted. By 10 in the morning, Vale grew impatient. By noon, he grew suspicious. By 1, he sent one of his lieutenants, Eddie Coyle, a thin man with polished shoes and dead eyes, to verify whether the pressure was actually biting. Coyle never made it back with a report. Not because he was dead, because he was turned. That was Bumpy's second answer to the crisis. Most men facing extortion would have used force first. Bumpy used memory. Marcus found Eddie Coyle in a coffee shop on 50th Street, sitting alone with a newspaper folded in front of him and one hand trembling slightly around a cup he hadn't touched. Marcus slid into the seat across from him. Coyle did not reach for a weapon. That told Marcus everything. "You know who I am," Marcus said. Coyle stared at the spoon beside his cup. "Yeah, you know why I'm here." Coyle swallowed. "Yeah." Marcus leaned back. "Then save us both time." The little man looked up. There was fear in him, yes, but there was something else too. Exhaustion. The kind that lives in people who joined bad men thinking ambition would make them harder than guilt. "He moved the drivers to the produce depot by the river," Coyle said. "Separate room. Tied, but alive." "Why alive?" "Insurance." "Who's with him?" 22, maybe 25 men across 3 sites. Depot, a counting room above a social club on 11th, and an apartment on 52nd he uses to meet people who don't want to be seen. Marcus watched him carefully. "Why are you telling me?" Coyle laughed once, bitterly. "Because Vale doesn't build anything. He strips it." Wherever he goes, the room gets colder. Nobody eats more. Nobody sleeps easier. Even when you win for him, it feels like losing slower. Marcus let that sit. "Why else?" Coyle's jaw tightened. "Because one of the drivers he grabbed, that's my cousin's boy." "And that mattered to you only this morning?" "No," Coyle said quietly. "It mattered the second I heard. This morning I just realized Vale would do it to any of us next." Marcus nodded once. There it was. Not loyalty, not redemption. Just the oldest pressure point in the world. Recognition. Eddie Coyle had finally understood that the machine he served did not distinguish between tool and target. Marcus stood. "You're going to keep breathing because you made the right choice at the right time." Coyle looked up. "That all?" Marcus gave him a stare so flat it silenced the room around them. "Don't ask for more." By 2 in the afternoon, Bumpy had everything he needed. Not every detail. He never waited for that luxury. Just enough. Enough to know Vale had split his operation because he trusted strategy over loyalty. Enough to know the missing drivers were alive because the extortion was still in phase 1. Enough to know the man had underestimated not Bumpy's violence, but his architecture. That afternoon, Bumpy called in only 8 men. Not 30, not 50. 8. That was what unsettled Marcus more than if he had called 100. "You sure?" Marcus asked. Bumpy buttoned his dark overcoat slowly. "A crowd is for war. We are not going to war." "What are we doing?" "We are ending a misunderstanding." The 8 men assembled in the basement were not the loudest names in Harlem. They were better than that. One had worked freight schedules on the docks for a decade and could smell fake manifests like smoke. One had fought in Europe and never raised his voice no matter how bad things got. One was a driver so steady he could take a corner under gunfire without spilling a drop from the coffee in his cup. One was a former boxer who understood timing the way musicians understand silence. The others were cutters, finishers, men who did not need speeches. Bumpy looked at each of them once. 3 locations, he said. No noise until necessary. Drivers come out alive. Records come back if they can. Veil does not leave breathing. No one asked why there were only 8. Because the men in that room understood something the streets often forgot. Precision looks small right up until the moment it closes around your throat. The first stop was the apartment on 52nd. Veil wasn't there. Bumpy had assumed he wouldn't be, but the apartment told its own story. 2 glasses on the table, fresh cigarette ash, a half-burned note in the sink, a telephone number written on a matchbook from a club near the freight yards. One of the men checked the bedroom and came back with a ledger. Marcus flipped through it quickly. "Payoffs," he said. "Drivers. Warehouse names. 2 cops, maybe 3. Bumpy held out his hand. Marcus gave him the book. There, on the 3rd page, beside a set of initials and percentages, was the quiet heartbeat of the whole operation. Not drugs, not guns. Fuel. Delivery fuel. Bribes tied to truck movement. Garages ready to swap plates and hide vehicles within minutes. Veil wasn't just blocking Bumpy's lines. He was building his own replacement lines underneath them. A parasite with ambition. Bumpy shut the ledger. "Burn nothing yet," he said. "We take the spine first." By the time they reached the social club on 11th Avenue, the sun had started to lower, washing the street in a pale winter gold that made the city look almost tender from a distance. Inside, it was not tender. 2 men at the door never got a chance to speak. A hand over one mouth, a forearm against the throat, a short, brutal struggle. Then silence. Upstairs, the counting room smelled of ink, whiskey, and cheap heat. 3 men around a table, money stacked in columns, 1 gun visible, maybe 2 more hidden. Marcus went left. The boxer went right. The war veteran straight through the middle. It took 11 seconds. 1 chair splintered backward against the wall. 1 pistol slid under a cabinet. 1 man dropped to his knees sobbing before anybody even touched him. Bumpy entered last. He looked around the room as if inspecting bookkeeping rather than collapse. "Where is Vincent Veil?" he asked. The sobbing man shook his head too fast. Marcus crouched in front of him. "Careful. Lies are expensive tonight." "He went to the depot," the man blurted. "Said if Harlem didn't bend by dark, he'd start sending back pieces." Nobody in the room moved for 1 full second. And then Bumpy's expression changed. It was small. So small, a stranger might have missed it.
but every man who worked with him felt the air sharpen. That wasn't anger in his face. Anger was easy. This was disappointment that had just become sentence. "Get the address confirmed," Bumpy said. The man did it before Marcus had to ask twice. When they stepped back outside, the daylight was almost gone. Harlem would be lighting lamps soon. Families would be setting tables. Radios would start carrying evening voices through thin apartment walls. Somewhere, children would still be laughing. And out near the freight yards, Vincent Vale was preparing to mail fear back uptown in pieces. Marcus looked at Bumpy as they climbed into the car.
You thinking what I'm thinking? Yes. He crossed from pressure into theater. Yes. Marcus shut the door hard. Then he's finished. The produce depot sat near the river like a rotten tooth. Half of its windows were boarded. The loading bay sagged. The cold there felt different from city cold. Colder, emptier, as if the wind had less humanity in it by the water. 2 cars were parked outside. One man smoked near the side entrance. Another stood in the loading bay, pretending not to be bored. Bumpy studied the building from across the street. "Drivers first," he said. Marcus nodded. "Vale?" Bumpy kept his eyes on the depot. If he's inside, he learns tonight. If he's not, he learns slower. They moved in with no wasted motion. The smoker died with surprise still on his face. The loading bay guard saw Marcus 1 second too late and reached for a weapon with fingers already behind the moment. Inside, the depot opened into aisles of empty crates and stale produce smell, the ghosts of old labor hanging in the beams above. Voices echoed from the back. One laugh, one curse, a chair scraping concrete. Then a muffled sound that no one in that building should have ignored. Bumpy and Marcus advanced down the central aisle with the others fanning wide. Boots soft on grit. Breath steady. Guns low and ready. The river wind hissed through cracks in the wall like something whispering not to hesitate. In the rear office, they found the drivers. 3 of them, bruised, tied, alive, and 1 chair overturned. Too recently. Marcus cut the first man free while Bumpy scanned the room. No Vale. Just another lieutenant with a split lip and too much false courage. "You're late," the lieutenant said. Bumpy looked at him the way men look at stains. "Am I?" The lieutenant smiled through blood. "He ain't here. He knew you'd come." "Of course he did. He said you'd save your own first. Said that's why he'll beat you. Said decent men lose to necessary ones." For the first time that day, Bumpy almost smiled. Not warmly. "Vincent Vale talks about necessity because he has never had to build anything people love," he said. The lieutenant spat at the floor. "He says by tomorrow every wheel in Harlem stops." Bumpy stepped closer. "No," he said softly. "By tomorrow, your people stop looking over their shoulders because they won't have shoulders anymore." Marcus finished cutting the last driver free. One of the rescued men, older than the others, grabbed Marcus's sleeve. "He took Benny." Marcus froze. "Which Benny?" "Little Benny Watts, the young runner. He saw too much this morning. Vale took him as he moved us." That changed the room. Not strategically, morally. And that mattered. Because the missing drivers were business. A teenage runner was something else. Marcus looked at Bumpy. No words needed. Bumpy's face hardened into something older than fury. "Where?" he asked the lieutenant. The man hesitated. The boxer broke his wrist. The scream lasted less than 2 seconds. "Where?" Bumpy repeated. "Pier house," the man gasped. "Old customs shed by the water. Vale said if he had to vanish tonight, the boy vanished first." For a moment, only the sound of the river remained. Then Bumpy turned. "Take the drivers home," he told 2 men. "Now." Marcus rose. "I'm coming with you." Bumpy glanced at him. "I know." If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. The pier house stood farther downriver than the depot, isolated enough that screams could blow out over black water and return as nothing. The road there was nearly empty. Street lamps thinned. The city seemed to loosen behind them, as if Manhattan itself did not entirely want to claim that stretch of cold industrial dark. In the car, nobody spoke for several minutes. Then Marcus said, "You know this ends loud." "Yes." "You know if Vale's cornered, he makes a scene." "Yes." "You care?" Bumpy stared through the windshield. "No." That was not bravado. It was arithmetic. Some nights in a city's life become too expensive for subtlety. By the time they saw the customs shed, there were only 6 of them left in the approach team. The others had peeled away with the drivers, the ledger, the captured records, the practical work of sealing the system back together. Now came the part history remembers wrong. People always imagine endings as explosions. They are rarely that generous. Usually an empire ends in a room where one man realizes too late that his plan was intelligent, but his understanding of human beings was thin. The shed had light inside. That was either arrogance or haste. Bumpy assumed both. A side window had been painted over long ago, but the paint had cracked. Through the fractures, Marcus saw movement. 3 men near the main table. 1 by the boy. Another near the door inside. No clear line on Vale. Marcus whispered the layout. Bumpy listened once. Then he said, "The boy comes out first. And if Vale's got a gun on him, he won't." "You sound sure." "Vale likes leverage too much to spend it early." Marcus gave a grim nod. He knew Bumpy was right. Men like Vale did not use hostages out of emotion. They used them like punctuation. That meant Benny was still alive because Vale still believed the night could be negotiated. A fatal misread. They entered through 2 points, front and side. The front went loud first. A crash of wood. A shout. Gunfire, breaking the warehouse stillness. The side moved faster. Marcus hit the man nearest the boy before the others understood the sound belonged to them. Benny dropped behind the chair as bullets cracked through the air and wood splintered near his face. Vale was at the back. Of course he was. Dark coat, gloves, calm eyes that had probably convinced many frightened men he was smarter than the room. He held a pistol, but not on the boy. On Bumpy. "You should have taken the deal," Vale said. Even now, his voice was controlled. That was the strange thing about ambitious men. They keep speaking as if the meeting is still salvageable long after the outcome has already chosen them. Bumpy stood in the center aisle amid dust, shattered wood, and the smell of river cold pushing through gaps in the boards. "No," he said. "You should have stayed a student." Vale smiled faintly. "You think this city is still run on old loyalties? It isn't. It runs on routes, wheels, warehouses, fuel, schedules. I cut the lines, and all your romance disappears. Benny crawled toward Marcus. One of Vale's men saw him and turned. The veteran dropped that man with one clean shot. Vale flinched at the sound, not with fear, but with irritation. There it was, the truth of him. Not a king, a manager offended by disorder. Bumpy took one step forward. Vale tightened his grip. Don't. You wrote me a letter. You needed to understand. No, Bumpy said. You needed to hear yourself. Vale's jaw shifted. Outside, somewhere in the dark, one of his remaining men tried to run and did not get far. The sound of that failure entered the room like a verdict. I could have worked with you, Vale said. Bumpy looked almost tired now. That's what all men say after they try to take food out of a neighborhood's mouth. Vale lifted the pistol higher. You think this is about neighborhoods? This is about systems. Whoever controls movement controls the future. And whoever forgets people while studying systems, Bumpy said, does not survive meeting the people. For the first time that night, Vincent Vale's calm slipped. Just a little, but enough. Enough for Marcus to see it. Enough for Bumpy to move on it. No dramatic dive, no shouted warning. Just timing. Bumpy shifted left as Marcus fired from the flank. Vale turned a fraction too slow, got one shot off into the rafters, and then the room ended him in 3 separate answers. When the echoes died, Benny was crying quietly against Marcus's coat. He wasn't bleeding, just shaking the way boys shake when they discover evil is not a story adults tell to keep them home at night. Marcus handed him to one of the men. Bumpy walked to where Vale had fallen. The man was still alive for a few seconds more. Long enough to understand. He looked up at Bumpy with dimming eyes and whispered, "You can't stop what's coming." Bumpy's face remained unreadable. "Maybe not," he said, "but I can stop you." Then Vincent Vale was gone, and with him went the blueprint, the confidence, the illusion that Harlem was an unattended machine waiting for a smarter thief. But Bumpy was not finished, because he knew something every serious leader knows. Removing the head means nothing if the hands are still free. So the next 12 hours became a disappearance, not magical, not mysterious, methodical. Before dawn, the ledger names were visited. The bought drivers were replaced or broken away. The compromised dispatcher in Jersey chose retirement over loyalty. A warehouse foreman with sticky palms left town before sunrise and did not return that year. 2 crooked patrolmen discovered that looking too closely at Harlem's routes would cost them stories they never wanted their wives hearing. By breakfast, 3 garages were under new management. By noon, the social club on 11th had become an empty room with wiped surfaces and no memory. By that evening, men who had eaten at Vale's table were either gone, silent, or swearing they had never met him at all. That is how people vanish in cities like New York. Not always into graves, sometimes into fear, sometimes into distance, sometimes into the sudden understanding that survival requires forgetting your own ambition before someone else remembers it for you. 24 hours after Harlem's supply line was cut, the men who had done it were simply absent. Gone from bars, gone from docks, gone from phone numbers, gone from borrowed apartments and quiet payroll lists and side door meetings. And because the city loves a mystery more than a truth, rumors began immediately. Some said Bumpy had them all buried by the river. Some said the Italians erased them to avoid a larger war. Some said they were sent west with broken hands as a warning to anyone who thought spreadsheets could conquer neighborhoods. The truth was more unsettling. Not all of them died. Some lived. And living scared was the point. Because a dead man tells one story. A frightened survivor tells 100. By the second night, Harlem was running cleaner than it had the week before. Routes adjusted. Collections doubled back into regular rhythm. Benny Watts, wrapped in a blanket and sitting in his aunt's kitchen, could still barely hold a cup without trembling. But he was alive. The rescued drivers were home. The policy banks reopened with a steadier kind of quiet. And on Lenox Avenue, ordinary people passed ordinary storefronts, with no idea how close the whole neighborhood had come to a kind of bloodless suffocation. That was the thing about crises built on invisible systems. Most people never know when they almost drowned. Late that evening, Marcus found Bumpy sitting alone again in the back room of the club, the same lamp above him, the same ledger open, as if the city had merely interrupted a bookkeeper for a day and then apologized. Marcus shut the door and stood there for a while. "You ever get tired?" he asked. Bumpy made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "All the time." "No, I mean, tired of seeing the whole board when the rest of us only see one move at a time." Bumpy looked up. "That isn't a gift, Marcus." "What is it then?" "A burden that pays well and sleeps badly." Marcus nodded once. Then he sat. For a few moments neither man spoke. Finally, Marcus said, "Vale was right about one thing." "That the city is changing?" "Yes." Bumpy turned a page in the ledger. "It always is," he said. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Then what's the lesson?" Bumpy considered the question. Outside, a car horn sounded. Somewhere farther down the block, laughter drifted up from the street. Life continuing. Always continuing. "The lesson," Bumpy said at last, "is that men get hypnotized by structure. Roots, money, supply, leverage. They begin to think power lives there." Marcus waited. "But power isn't in the root," Bumpy said quietly. "Power is in whether people trust you enough to rebuild the root before sunrise." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. That was it. That was the difference. Vincent Vale had understood logistics. Bumpy understood belonging. One can be stolen. The other has to be earned, defended, and renewed every day. That was why Harlem stayed standing. Not because it feared him more than anyone else, but because when pressure came, the neighborhood did not ask whether Bumpy could save himself. It moved to save itself through him. And that kind of bond is what outsiders never understand until their plans collapse in their hands. Vale had looked at Harlem and seen percentages. Bumpy looked at Harlem and saw pulse. That was why one man wrote letters and the other rewrote endings. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. In the weeks that followed, nobody publicly claimed responsibility for what happened. That was another lesson. Real control rarely needs applause. Police reports called it a series of unrelated disappearances tied to labor disputes and organized vice. Newspapers flirted with the phrase, "uptown retaliation," but could never pin names to events that had already been professionally folded back into the city. Downtown men learned quickly that Harlem's routes were not just cash lanes to be intercepted. They were defended arteries, the kind that fought back. Frankly, that was enough. No major meeting was called, no speech was given, no parade of force marched up the avenue. There did not need to be. One rumor did the work of 100 gunmen. They tried to starve Harlem. 24 hours later, nobody could find the men who tried. That line spread fast because it was simple. And simple stories survive. Years later, old-timers would tell it differently, depending on what they valued. Some said Bumpy won because he was ruthless. They were wrong. Ruthlessness was common. Some said he won because he was feared. They were wrong too. Fear mattered, but fear alone breaks under pressure. No, he won because he understood the difference between owning a system and being the reason it rises again when somebody tries to break it. That is rarer than violence, and more durable. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to mistake survival for hardness, to imagine that the men who endure are made of stone. But that is not true. Stone cracks. Stone sinks. Stone forgets to bend. Men like Bumpy endured because they felt the weight fully and still chose function over panic. Think about that for a moment. A neighborhood's money routes are cut. Trusted people disappear. A new predator sends a message demanding tribute. The city is changing beneath your feet. One wrong public move, one bad guess, one night of panic, and everything you built begins to unravel. Most men would react. Bumpy responded. That is why the story lasted. Not because there were guns in dark rooms. New York has never run short on those. Not because a rising challenger disappeared. There is nothing unusual about ambition dying in this city. The story lasted because it revealed the invisible architecture behind survival. Discipline over drama. Memory over noise. Community over calculation. A man who thought like a machine challenged a man who understood human blood. The machine lost. And maybe that is why the story still feels alive, because it is not only about gangsters and roots and winter nights by the river. It is about what happens in any life when somebody decides they can control you by cutting your supply line. Your confidence, your income, your routine, your support, your sense of who you are. Some people collapse the moment that line is severed. Others rebuild so fast the attack becomes a confession of weakness on the attacker's part. That was Bumpy's real answer. He did not simply strike back. He proved Harlem could absorb the cut and keep moving long enough to choose the place of reply. That is power. Not the first blow, not the loudest threat, not the cruelest demonstration. The power to remain functional while wounded. The power to think while under pressure. The power to make the other man realize, too late, that his best move only revealed where he could be found. And Vincent Vale did reveal himself. He announced what he valued. Roots, fuel, timetables, fear. He put his whole philosophy on paper in one typed note, believing clarity made him superior. But whenever a man tells you exactly how he plans to control the world, he is also telling you where to break him. Bumpy heard that immediately. Because age, when it survives long enough, teaches pattern recognition better than any school ever could. He knew men like Vale. They believe they are modern because they replace temper with planning. But planning without wisdom is just colder arrogance. And cold arrogance still bleeds. By the end, the city barely noticed the cleanup. That may be the most New York detail of all. A near war in hidden rooms. Drivers rescued. Names erased. Lines redrawn beneath the visible city. And above it all, people still catching buses, buying coffee, hurrying to work, carrying groceries, arguing with lovers, praying in churches, laughing in bars, dreaming ordinary dreams over extraordinary machinery. That is how cities survive their own darkness. By layering normal life over private battles so tightly that history has to pry them apart with both hands. Maybe somewhere near the river, on a night wind sharp enough to cut through a coat, a man once looked over black water and understood that he had bet against the wrong neighborhood. Maybe some of Vale's surviving helpers carried that lesson west, south, or into old age. Maybe Benny Watts, years later, told the story to someone else, with his coffee cup steady in his hand at last. Maybe Marcus, long after the danger passed, still remembered the look on Bumpy's face when he heard a boy had been taken. Not rage, not chaos, decision. That was always the final shape of him. Not a saint, not a symbol, a decision made flesh. And that is why, in 1960, when they cut off Bumpy's supply line, the city did not witness a collapse. It witnessed a test of whether Harlem was merely an operation or something deeper. A test of whether power could be stolen by interrupting movement. A test of whether a man built on discipline could be forced into foolishness. 24 hours later, the answer had been written across warehouses, dock roads, social clubs, back rooms, and the frightened memory of anyone who had stood too close to Vincent Vale's grand design. No, Harlem did not fold. Bumpy did not bend. And the men who thought they could starve a kingdom learned the same lesson all invaders learn eventually. If you strike at a place without understanding what keeps it alive, you may wound it, but you may also teach it exactly where to aim when it answers. And when Harlem answered, it did not shout. It did not beg. It did not explain. It simply kept breathing, while the men who tried to choke it vanished into the kind of silence they had planned for someone else. That was the irony. That was the justice. And that was the story. If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories.